Good morning, everybody, and thank you to join. Thank you for your time to be here in another amazing webinar. This time with Dr. Ram Gopal, and it's time to learn new things. And let me introduce him actually. By the way, good afternoon to you, Ram Gopal. You are like in
Good
Europe.
morning. Yeah. Good morning, Alejandro.
Thank you. But well, who's Professor Ram D. Gopal? Well, he's professor of information systems management and analytics at Warwick Business School and academic director of the Gilmore Center for Financial Technology. He has published more than 100 peer review articles with around 9,000 citations. You are a specialist in AI, in technology, information management. So big deal in the ecosystem. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And I really look forward to talking about my research and getting any feedback and comments. So I hopefully look forward to a very, very lively webinar.
Totally. We will have a great session. And feel free to all the audience to ask any question in the platform where you are watching it. And during the presentation, Ram will answer your questions or comments. And I think that's it. Let's start with the with the webinar.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to talk to you today about some of my research on this construct that I'm calling sentiment and how that has impacted in the age of generative AI, and that is potentially having significant implications in many organizations. Uh, I want to acknowledge the Gilmore Center for Financial Technology because that's the center that has provided funding for this research. I also want to acknowledge my amazing co-authors, Yi Deng, F.E. Wong, and Ashkan S.G. They're all my colleagues here in the Warwick Business School. Well, to set the context for this research, since the advent of social media, one of the biggest applications for organizations has been to use social media to understand their customers, understand the public perception about their products and offerings. To give you some examples, for example, in the finance sector, algorithmic trades are heavily driven by the sentiment on the news media and on social media. In public policy, often officials watch the sentiment on social media, and that actually impacts the political campaign strategy, the public health messaging, and how they respond to different crises. And in the context of marketing, as I'm sure many of you know, customer reviews play a very important role in terms of pricing the products, in terms of demand forecasting and inventory management. So as you can see, sentiment that is captured on social media actually is an important driver to lots of important business decisions across the spectrum of industries. But there's a foundational assumption, and that assumption is that all the text that is sitting on these platforms that companies try to capture, analyze, and act on, it's a true reflection of the human authors who posted that content. And that's been well and good up until recently. Our main contention in the research is that since the advent of generative AI, the late 2022, this assumption is fundamentally broken and is no longer the case. If you think about what happened pre-2022, the pipeline was that humans would offer their thoughts, comments in the form of some text that they post, and then social media platforms would then extract the text, and they use various algorithms to analyze the sentiment and that then flows into the subsequent decision-making processes. Since 2022, I think that has changed. What we find significant evidence for is that before they actually post the messages on these platforms, human beings are increasingly using LLM to help them to adapt, to improve the draft of what they write. Now, the question is, once this text goes through some LLM-based edits, is that still a true, is that truly capturing the human sentiment that the human wants to express? So that was the question. And to give you a more concrete example of it, on the screen, you see on the left-hand side is what a human written draft might look like. It says Apple CEO Tim Cook telling user, thrilled to have Warren and Berkshire as major investor. You put that through an LLM, it tries to improve the meaning of it and makes the grammar better. So it could be rewritten as Apple CEO Tim Cook expressed to user his excitement about having Warren and Berkshire as significant investors. So in terms of the semantics, both the left-hand side text and the right-hand side text seem to be very similar. So the semantic meaning of what the user wants to express is preserved. However, what changes is the sentiment that you extract by using different algorithms. On the screen, you used one of the very common and popular sentiment algorithms called Vader. And what you see is that the Vader sentiment for the text on the left and the right is not the same. Okay? It has shifted. Then you might ask, perhaps this is just an issue with the particular algorithm that we are using. So we actually experimented with this with a variety of different sentiment algorithms, including Vader, TextBlob. These are more traditional sentiment analysis techniques, and as well more recent transformer-based sentiment algorithms such as Roberta and a distilled version called Distilbert. This shift in sentiment is salient across all the different analytics algorithms. And you might also wonder, perhaps this is only true for certain types of text, perhaps Amazon reviews. Maybe they're not true for what you find on Twitter. So we experimented with both short form text like tweets and also long form text like Amazon reviews. Across the different types of posts, we find that there's been a significant shift in sentiment. You could potentially ask, perhaps this is a problem with the generative AI tool. As generative AI gets better, perhaps this problem will go away. Again, our experimentation shows that now as you test these across different versions, in this case, we use different versions of GPT, the problem persists. So it's not really a question of just an issue with generative AI models. And perhaps one last concern you might have is that perhaps there's a change in the sentiment because you don't exactly know how to ask the LLM the right way. In other words, you're not doing prompting correctly. Again, we tested this. We tried a variety of different prompts, including asking the LLM to try and preserve the original authenticity of the message. Does not work. Regardless of which model, which prompting technique, which sentiment analysis technique you use, there's a shift in the captured human sentiment. Now, at this point, you might be wondering why. Why does this happen with LLMs? We believe that LLMs are not just neutral, harmless, innocuous text converters. They're not neutral calculators. Essentially, most large language models mediate the content. They editorialize the content a bit through some kind of a normative prior. In most LLMs, it comes in the form of RLHF, reinforcement learning through human feedback. the essential goal of this process is to make the models to be more helpful, more harmless, and be polite. And the result of that is whatever text you put into it, it tries to bring it down to a house tone, so to speak. And this essentially is the cause of the phenomena that we observe. And in terms of the impact it has for downstream activities, there are three big impacts that arise. One is the mean shift. The second one is the variance compression. And the third one is what's called rank distortion. So let me explain what these are. First, with respect to the mean shift, what we find across financial tweets and Amazon reviews is that in every case, there is a statistically significant shift in reviews. And what happens consistently is that negative sentiment becomes less negative and positive sentiment becomes more positive. So there is a systematic shift that happens in the sentiment that is extracted from LLM modified text. The second issue is what's called variance compression. Typically, on social media, when people express their opinions, there's a full spectrum of opinions that people express, from very negative to very positive. What LLMs do is they compress that dispersion. Again, the idea is to make them behave and make them express things more neutrally. So the true original spread in the sentiments that people actually want to express gets completely compressed. So that's the variance compression that happens. And finally, rank order distortion. Some could argue that I understand that when people use LLMs to help modify the content before they post it, the actual sentiment score could change. But that doesn't really matter in many contexts. For example, in recommendation systems, or you want to monitor your brand compared to your other competitors, it's not the absolute score, it's the relative ranking. On the table on the left-hand side, you see the ranking of sentiments of 4 different companies. So company A is ranked the highest, company B next, and so on. Even if there's a change in the sentiment scores, as long as you preserve that rank order, I'm okay. My subsequent downstream analysis is not negatively impacted. Again, what our results find is that the correlation of the rank order, it does change a lot. So in fact, the correlation coefficient drops to 0.6 to 0.7 range, which is quite a bit of a change in the rank order. So these are the problems that we observed and we measured. Now, the question becomes, what are the downstream impacts of this sentiment alteration? I think the best way to think about it in terms of a statistical perspective is to treat this as a measurement error. On the left-hand side is what you really want to measure, which is authentic human sentiment. But in the age of LLMs, what you observe is LLM polished sentiment, which is as altered. These are not equivalent. There's a measurement error. So alpha in that equation measures the mean shift, the bias that is incorporated by the shift of the mean. And beta is the variance compression factor. And then even after that, you still have some non-negligible error that you cannot simply overcome. I think it probably is helpful to take a look at an analogy. Suppose you want to measure temperature, and you come up with a very crude instrument that tries to measure temperature. Now, if you think about using this as a way to measure temperature, one problem could be that there's a mean shift that happens. In other words, this particular device that you're trying to measure always gives you a temperature that is higher than the actual temperature. So that is a shift, is a bias shift. And the second problem with this device might be that it's not really good at measuring temperatures that are too low or too high. So once the temperature drops below a threshold or it goes beyond another threshold, then it simply can't measure it. So that's your variance compression. And the last one is simply the fact that this is a very crude approximation of the true temperature. It will be imprecise, and that will result in some errors. So I think this is the impact that we need to be cognizant of and understand the implications of it. Again, the point I'm trying to make here is that what we really want to measure is the true sentiment. What we actually observe now is an altered sentiment. So what's the impact of this on downstream analysis? Suppose you want to understand what's the impact of sentiment on my product sales, as an example. If you had true human sentiment, what you would see is something like the plot on the left-hand side. Okay? It's a very good correlation, very good fit between sentiment and the demand. But once LLMs modify the sentiment, then what happens is, because of this attenuation, the relationship between sentiment and your output becomes quite weak. So in other words, even though the true relationship between the sentiment expressed by people and your subsequent demand is very high, once you start measuring LLM modified sentiment, that relationship weakens. And another consequence of this measurement error is that it lowers the statistical power of your models. A very common metric for to measure the overall fit of the model is R squared. And R squared basically drops quite significantly in case you have significant measurement errors. Okay, now what does all this mean? Let me give you some examples. In, let's say, algorithmic trading, what might happen is, because of attenuation, the model thinks that the sentiment is not really having an impact on some outcomes of interest, and it will attribute whatever happens with respect to the market as pure noise, as opposed to sentiment being the key driving factor. So you draw wrong conclusions. In the context, for example, of inventory planning, because LLMs tend to make everything positive, the end result of any analysis you perform subsequently essentially will show that the review sentiment is really high. So there's nothing to worry about. And based on that, you actually make very unwise decisions in terms of pricing, inventory management, markdowns, and things like that. In terms of crisis monitoring, because what it does is it does variance compression. It does not allow you to truly understand the true spectrum of the sentiment. And because of that, if you study sentiment on social media, what you might wrongly conclude is that there is no big problem. And as a result, whatever response you plan for is too little and too late. So as you can see, by having this sentiment be distorted on social media, the consequence is that you could end up making very unwise decisions that could have significant implications downstream. The next question that we wanted to address is, okay, we understand now that the sentiment as it appears on social media is no longer reliable. Can we do something about it? Can we try and fix it? So we attempted two different approaches. One is called single loop learning. The second one is called double loop learning. The first one is more of an operational repair, and the second one is more of an architectural repair. Let me explain what that means. So in the first one, in operational repair, we take whatever sentiment score that is produced from the algorithm based on biased data. We know that this score is not correct. And then we attempt to take this score and see if we can try to recover what the true sentiment might be. So you're basically working on the output produced by the LLM. The second one is more of an architectural approach. And again, in this case, you understand that the text that LLMs produce are modified. Now, what you want to do is just don't rely on that text. Perhaps you can do some fine tuning to see if the text produced by LLM can be reverse engineered to try to come up with text that more closely mimics what a human being would have said. And that is more of an architectural repair. So for the first one, we use an approach called sequential rephrasing, which I'll explain in a minute. And for the second one, we use traditional fine-tuning approach that is commonly used with large language models. So with sequential rephrasing, the idea is very simple. If you take some text and you put it through LLM and then do the sentiment changes. We've shown that already. Okay, so what happens if you do it one more time? You take the revised text and then revise it again and do the sentiment. The sentiment again changes. So each time you rephrase the text and calculate the sentiment keeps changing. Now the question is, how does that behave over time? And does it plateau and become a steady state? If it does, then we can try to reverse engineer true original sentiment. As you can see on the plots here, pretty much with all techniques, after 2 or 3 rephrasings, the sentiments tend to become fairly steady. And this was good news for us, because once we have enough of a training set, we can then take this steady state sentiment score after several rephrasings and use that to try and recover what the original sentiment was. And interestingly, it's a great question from Rosleo. Let me just hold that till the end, if you don't mind, because there are pretty significant implications. So this works really well, and what we find is that it works really well in terms of getting the bias out, but it struggles a little bit to deal with the rank orders. With the second approach, which is double loop architectural fix of fine tuning, the idea here is that we take some original human tweets that we know are authentic, and then we use LLMs to create modified variants of these tweets. And then we ask LLM to fine tune to reverse engineer. So if I give you some LLM rephrased text, can you try to recover and rewrite it as a human being would? This works really well, especially in terms of preserving the rank order, but in terms of eliminating bias, it's almost there, but it's not perfect. So our main takeaway here is that both these techniques work in part, but the best is to combine the two. And if you combine the two, what we find is that we can essentially eliminate the bias. We can try to limit the amount of shrinkage that happens with these statistics, and the error variance, which is a key factor in trying to understand the impact of various variables in your regression, that drops by a factor of 4. So essentially, our main takeaway from this is that if you're cognizant of the problem and if you apply the right approaches, you can in fact overcome the bias that is introduced by the LLMs. Well, let me just talk a little bit about from an organization's point of view. Our research has some implications for your data supply chains. I know in lots of organizations, they either scrape the data from the web or they hire humans on platforms such as Mechanical Turk. The problem is that neither one is reliable, and there's ample evidence that show that human beings who are supposed to respond as human beings on Mechanical Turk are increasingly using ChatGPT to provide the responses. So you're not sure if you're getting authentic human response or some LLM modified response. So from that perspective, I think any data sets that organizations have, which are pre-2022, before the advent of generative AI, is golden. Right? So that gives you a data set that is authentically human. I think that's really important. And what I would also suggest is that in addition to that, most likely, most organizations will need to run specialized focus studies or specialized experiments, at least with a small subset of the potential consumers, for example, and try to understand the true sentiment. Just make sure that you compensate them enough for them to give you a true response that is not LLM altered. So in terms of what data becomes valuable in this day and age of human sentiment being polluted by large language models, the answer is if you have pre-2022 data, that becomes golden, because that becomes your ground truth, so that when you're looking at LLM altered text, you know how to recover that. And the second approach is to, as I mentioned, to run focus studies periodically and try to collect the true human sentiment. And you can use that as a basis to correct what you actually observe on online social media platforms. And I guess the last message I have here is that you need to start thinking about this in terms of your pipeline. You have to start treating sentiment that you measure as something that is measured with error. You need to audit your data, the provenance of your data, very carefully. And especially if it's post-2022 and it's web scraped from online sources, it is highly suspect. And if the data provenance proves to be problematic, then we recommend use some recovery mechanisms. We provided two. So if ranking of sentiment scores matters to you, then fine-tune. If the magnitude matters to you, then sequentially rephrase. But if your downstream activity is more about inference, then use both. And lastly, I think it'll become increasingly important part of your governance to openly disclose challenges with the sentiment in terms of the models that you create, the model cards you provide, and any disclosures that you need to engage in. I guess in closing, my point is that most of what you see on online social media sites nowadays, it's been polluted. It's been polluted through the influence of LLMs. And it's not because of the prompting, it's not because of the model, it's because of the fundamental nature of these LLMs, which is to try to be as helpful and as harmless as possible. And this can have significant repercussions downline, and organizations that are aware of it and then can take measures to counteract this will benefit from any analysis, any decision-making that they undertake that's based on sentiment. I guess with that, I will close, and I'll be more than happy to take any questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Ram.
Okay.
Really interesting. Really impressed, by the way. It feels like with the LLMs, we have like a filter in our communications, like as we have it in the past, well, as we have it in Instagram or TikTok, now in the way that we express and share ideas, now we have another filter because of the use of
Yeah.
LLMs.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think people are not aware of it. I think the first step towards correcting anything is awareness, right? I think part of what we're trying to do is to show awareness and also make the point that this is not a problem that's going to go away, right? GPT version 10 will not fix the problem. Right? This is something that's fundamental. And I think that's something we need to be aware of. And more broadly, I think when you see viewpoints being expressed online, you're unsure, is that true human point of view, or somehow it's some amalgam of AI and human, right? And That's okay in some cases, but in many cases where you truly want to understand what the human being's opinions are, because whatever decisions you make subsequently should rely on the human sentiment, then I think you need to be very careful.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And actually, I think last week we have a conversation also about AI. And well, all the webinars are about AI, but it was really interesting that also it was about how a lot of extra, like more, it's like really neutral all the time. Like are like the LLMs do not express really well the
Yes.
viewpoints from people with or
Yeah.
super religious or super from
Right.
the right or super
Yeah.
left, like are everything like really kind of curated in the way of the LLM point of view.
Yeah, and I think that's homogenizing things, right? And once you start to homogenize, then it becomes less human. Being human means to have this dispersion, this variety of viewpoints and perspectives, and and from that point of view, I think LLMs are not a positive news in the sense it's suppressing the breadth of opinions, suppressing the variations in how people feel, have opinions about. There was a question about how do you
Yeah.
measure public opinion in the future. That's a great question, and I think one quick answer is that just trying to understand the public opinion by looking at social media and is not sufficient, right? It will be highly misleading. So I think there have to be some filters, some intervention that needs to be done. In the good old days before social media, the way you would gather public opinion is by doing this focus studies, right? Or phoning up people and talking to them, right? So perhaps we may have to go back to some of that, right? We may have to go back to that at least to anchor, like the two techniques we provided, sequential rephrasing and fine tuning. They require some ground truth. Right? So what will need to happen is that periodically you need to do these focus studies, you need to do these interviews to get actual ground truth, at least for a sample. Then you can learn from the sample, and then you can use that on social media opinions to reverse engineer and try to get the true public opinions as much as possible. So I think you'll have to begin to take these additional steps.
Really, yeah, totally makes sense. And I love how you have like a strong cut, like pre 2022 is golden data,
Yeah, yeah,
like real true information. And it's funny how the new technologies, because are creating those effects, we need to go back to the basics and do some old-fashioned methodologies.
yeah. And I think this is the question about should we see pre 2022 data as more accurate or real? I think that's true. Right? And I would say that even pre 2022, it wasn't perfect either. Right? We had the problem of bots, for example. Right? So who's expressing the sentiment? Is it a human being or is it a bot? Right? So there's a lot of work done, lots of debates about how do we separate true human express sentiment, but from what's been expressed by bots. And there's also concerns about fake reviews. Right? People write reviews that they don't actually mean, right? Because they get paid to write those reviews. And again, the concern was there even before. Right? The concern was different. It was more about fake reviews, about bots, right? But those were still, to some extent, quite limited in the sense that it wasn't as widespread. But now with LLMs, pretty much everything you see is unreliable. And I think to some extent, it's a different source of trying to quiet the human voice, and the scale is much higher.
Yeah, totally. And there's any I really like the methodology of reverse engineer.
Yeah,
But do you think that because there are like people, millions of people that use LLMs to filter their
yeah,
comments,
right.
but there are like still like people that express their opinions,
Yeah,
mainly the
yeah,
negative, maybe. maybe
Yeah.
that's a bias there. But there's a way to kind of separate, or what do you recommend like here?
Yeah. So I think one thing I should have, and I didn't go into the details of our approaches, right? So with both fine tuning and sequential rephrasing, okay, what we make sure is that whether the what you see is real or not real, you want to recover it. Right? So if it is real, it recovers the real. If it is fake, then it recovers the real. Right? So I think in terms of both fine tuning and sequential rephrasing, uh, what we look at is body of text. Some of it is changed by LLMs, some of it is not. Right? So we want to keep that in mind because a lot of times you don't know the provenance. In other words, how did the data come about? Right? Did people use LLMs? If so, which ones? And how did they rephrase? Or did they not use it? Right? So you don't know the provenance. So we want our techniques to work even if you don't know the provenance of the data. So,
Okay.
so in that sense, it does work regardless. So if, for example, everything you see is authentic human, it will retain all of that.
Okay, makes sense. Um, and and last question, like, what do you surprise you the most when you see like all this change in the tone, yeah, how they, like in all this process of analyzing all this data, like what was your the most surprising thing that you discover? Or, well, the paper is amazing and all in general, but for you personally, what was like less
Yeah.
expected?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, not just in with this paper, but LLMs in general, and I see this in, as professor, I teach classes, as I see students submit their reports and essays. As a researcher, I see reviews, research articles. Right? I think the big problem that we'll have to face as a society is that what you're reading looks so good, prima facie, right, at the surface, because LLMs just rewrite so well. Right? Everything reads well, right? But and because of that, it becomes very difficult now to separate good from bad. Right? So in the past, if a student submits an essay, and let's say the student didn't put in any effort, it was very easy to figure out that not much effort went into this. Right? So you can separate good students from bad students, or good submissions from bad submissions. Nowadays, that become very difficult because even if I don't do much work, I just ask LLMs to write something. Right? Or even if I put a lot of effort and I ask LLM to help me rewrite it, you compare the two, it's very difficult unless you really dig in deep, understand, right? It becomes much more difficult to separate the wheat from the chaff. And I think you'll see that across, whether it's reviews, tweets, reports, research, everything. Um, and that I think is a problem for us as human beings.
By the way, you as a professor, like, how do you, because a lot of professors like face the last years this issue that they are start to receive all great essays,
Yeah.
homework, like everything. So at the end, how what, maybe it's a little bit off topic, but it will be
No,
interesting
no,
to
I
see.
think I think I think it's not actually that much off topic, right? It is true, right? So, the way I've adapted this is to number one, encourage students to use LLMs. Right? It's a tool that they will need once they graduate and they start working. Right? And preventing them from using a tool is doing them a disservice because you're not giving them the skills that they need. Right? So I think trying to ban or limit usage is the wrong strategy. I've always believed that. Right? Now, if in terms of assessing students, it's very hard to differentiate good from the bad. Right? That is our problem, not the students' problem. Right? So I think we need to innovate there. And I try to do that in several different ways. So, for example, I don't usually ask them to write an essay. Right? So what I do sometimes is I craft an essay based on LLM. Okay, look, this is the Chat GPT based essay, right? I want you to find holes in this. Right? And they can still use ChatGPT, right? But they'll have to use it more intelligently.
Mhm.
It can't be just blind. And so I think so in that sense, so what the message to students that I try to communicate is that one of two ways in which you can use AI. One is to make the job easier and make you dumber, or to make you smarter. Right? So use it to make you smarter. And I think our assessments, how we interact with students, how we evaluate students, how we teach students should all be done with this in mind. And I think when you do it correctly, it actually helps the learning process. But
Yeah.
this is a fundamental shift that needs to happen across the entire education system. Right? It'll take some time, but I think we'll get there eventually.
Eventually.
Eventually, yeah.
Yeah, totally. Really nice. So I think that that's it. Thank you so much, Ram Gopal. How, if they have like any question or like doubt, where they can find your research, your
Yes.
future papers?
Please, no, I think you can just search for me online, Warwick Business School professor with my name. You'll find me easily. A lot of my research is available online. A lot of the work that we do for the Gilmore Center for Financial Technology, that is lots of AI, lots of blockchain, crypto, it's all available online. And happy to take any questions and happy to have any discussions. If anyone is interested in potentially collaborating, more than happy to do that as well. So
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Professor Ram. Have a
thank you.
great rest of the week, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. Appreciate your time.